I'm going to be talking about public transport today, and in particular about how we can encourage more people to use public transport. The speech begins now. Ladies and gentlemen, a lot is said about the importance of public transport to society. It's described as being important in terms of ensuring mobility for all. Let's face it, not everybody can afford to have their own car. And it's also considered an important way of protecting the environment, in that fewer emissions will be emitted in society if more of us leave our own cars at home and decide to use public transport instead. However, one big problem here is that most of us already have a car. A recent survey showed that 80% of adults in the European Union own their own vehicle. So if we want people to use public transport more and their own cars less, how are we going to achieve that? For it to happen, for you to persuade someone to leave their car at home and to jump on a bus or a train instead, public transport is going to have to offer them a credible alternative. Now, when I say credible, I mean credible in a number of ways. Let me mention 4. Public transport has to be accessible. It's not very practical if it's a 2-kilometre walk to your nearest train station or bus stop. Secondly, it has to be reliable. It doesn't help if you board a train and then it arrives at its destination 3/4 of an hour late, meaning that you turn up late for your first business meeting and annoy your colleagues and your customers. Thirdly, it has to be comfortable. Sometimes commuter trains are incredibly overcrowded and you have to stand all the way into the centre of London. When people think of that, then they're probably tempted to go in by car instead. And fourthly, the public transport option has to be affordable. It's no good if travelling by train costs you more than driving to work in your own car. I think it should be remembered here that season tickets in the United Kingdom often cost several £1,000s for the rail network, so the sums of money at stake here are actually an important factor. Now, whether public transport where you live can meet the 4 criteria that I mentioned depends largely on precisely that, where you live. In other words, if you live in a fairly large urban area like Brussels or my home city of Leeds in the UK, then probably all of those criteria are met. The public transport is relatively reliable, it's pretty affordable, fairly accessible. On the other hand, if you take a small town, perhaps 20 or 30 kilometres away from a city like Leeds, then you would find that almost none of those boxes would be ticked, almost none of those criteria would be met. Now, the prices would be, broadly speaking, the same, so affordability is not an issue, but the public transport is not very accessible. You may have a long walk to your nearest train station. And often the service is not that regular. This can mean then that your working day ends up being rather long. If you have to leave home, 2 hours before starting work in the morning and don't get home until 2 hours after you've finished work in the evening. And if you work unusual hours, say for example if you do night shifts, then you might find that there's no service available at all, and that will thus force you to go to work by car. So what then can be done about all this? Well, I think it's probably somewhat unrealistic to think that much will be done about the situation of public transport in the small town that I was just describing. Transport operators will always argue that there won't be enough demand in small places like that to justify investing in such services. I think it's worth remembering here that public transport services in the United Kingdom are often provided by private operators and are no longer directly run by state-owned companies or by local authorities. And when you talk about investment, to be perfectly honest, in this era of austerity, I can't imagine that local government or national government will step in and provide any financial incentives to those private transport operators to make the necessary investments. So against that backdrop, perhaps a more realistic option would, from an environmental perspective, would be to encourage car share schemes. These are schemes where people who work together and who live in the same area decide that they will take turns to drive each other into work. They save money, and of course it means fewer emissions because there are fewer cars on the road. Maybe an even better option for the future from an environmental perspective would be to develop electric cars. But I think this is something more for the long-term future, as there's still inadequate infrastructure in the UK for any widespread deployment of electric cars. For example, there are not enough charging points. So you could drive somewhere on a fully charged battery in the morning and then suddenly find that there was nowhere to charge it up in the evening so that you could get back home. That's not really a very practical solution for a worker. Let me end by saying something about large urban areas, about cities, where there is a fairly developed public transport network, but where problems of traffic congestion and, of course, also then air and noise pollution are highest. I think in these areas we should try a carrot and stick approach. When I talk about carrots, I mean that we should provide incentives to get people out of their cars and onto buses, trams and trains. Now, if you have a very good service, then that is an incentive in itself in a given city. In this respect, speed is all important. For example, if buses can use a separate bus lane and leave all the waiting cars behind them, then that actually gives passengers a great incentive to travel to work by bus and not by car. And of course, you'd be more likely to take the London Underground to work if there were more carriages and fewer people in each carriage. You could then sit and read your newspaper on your commute into work. And if the carrots don't work, ladies and gentlemen, then maybe we need to use some sticks. In other words, provide disincentives to using private cars. Now, when I talk about disincentives, what I have in mind is making it harder, more expensive to use your car. This might mean increasing taxation on motoring. For example, it can be made more expensive to buy a car in the first place by increasing the level of VAT charged on purchases of new cars. And it can also be made harder to run a car by increasing the taxes levied on petrol, for example, and diesel. And then another method which has been used quite recently in cities such as London and Stockholm is to introduce a congestion charge, whereby people who insist on driving into central London on a daily basis have to pay a certain amount of money every time they enter the area of London subject to the congestion charge. And obviously over a period of many months and years, the amount of money spent on the congestion charge becomes actually very significant. But I think the main message here is that there's never a one-size-fits-all approach that you can take. There's no one solution that will work for every city. And for that reason, You need solutions which are adapted to local conditions, and I think here that there's a huge amount of scope for us to learn from one another in our various cities around Europe and around the wider world in order to find the best solution for every place. Thank you.